Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our second session of our six-part series on creating our Shiny applications and dashboards. I want to thank the Bureau of Justice Statistics for their support, which makes this training possible. I want to welcome back our presenter, Dr. Robert Ashmead. If you remember, Dr. Robert Ashmead is a senior statistician at NORC at the University of Chicago.
Okay. Um, as we were saying, this is the second session. We're kind of building on what we did last time, but before we kind of get into, more of the details, just a few reminders about the materials and the resources. You should have the link to this GitHub page, and there should be materials for both session one and session two there. The other thing I wanted to remind people of is, in case you weren't here for the first session, there was a step in the first session where we downloaded some of the data that we've been working with. So Oh, the other thing, the easiest way to pull the materials off is with you to go to the GitHub and download these as a zip and unzip them on your local machine. Um, to download the main examples, the data for the main examples we're using today, there's kind of a slide in the middle of the session one HTML slides that has the links to download that, slide 31, if you need that, where we're pulling the data from. Okay, and with that, we can get going on our session two. So, last time we talked about the different pieces of a Shiny app. We talked about the two mandatory parts, UI and server, and some optional parts, global and the www folder. And then we kind of got into the multiple steps to creating a basic app, and we covered the first four: loading the data, adding input widgets, working in the server to combine the inputs with data to produce outputs, putting the outputs in the UI. And then today we're going to get to this last step of adding layout and design features to the UI. So the first thing we'll tackle today, the first thing we're going to tackle is we're going to go over some of the take-home exercises, but then the new material we'll cover is layouts and design features. We'll get into how to put some static plots coming from ggplot into our dashboards, and then we'll finish with some the information about reactive expression. So for making more complex manipulations in our dashboards. Okay, so if you attended the last session, I kind of posed these take-home activities if you wanted to kind of test what you've learned, try out a couple additional examples, so forth on and the first one was on our working example that we had been doing, the Florida arrest information. And there were kind of three different bullets here, which I suggested as possible things to try out. So adding a date range selection and filter. So you could have a start and end date to your data for the analysis, an option to remove records with missing values, and adding an option to select a second variable that would allow the analysis to be computed within groups. So I'm wondering if now that we have our interactive uh, uh, session for our webinar, did anyone take me up on the take-home activity? And does anyone want to share or have questions about any of that? I can show you what I did, but if anyone else had questions, if they tried to tackle it, I'm happy to. spend a little bit of time there as well. Okay, well, let me at least start off with what I did for these particular ones. A reminder, so this is in the examples for session two, and this is take home one. And I'm opening up run take home one. And the thing to remember when you're opening our studio here is just make sure to set your working directory again by right clicking on the file and clicking set working directory. And I'll run this quickly. Okay. So we talked about three things. The first thing was a filter, a date filter with a to and a from, um, to filter the data that we were showing in our computing in our table. So I've got that here. We get this nice calendar function, and you can see if I actually switch these, the numbers change depending on when the dates fall. So you could pick specific, a single date, a year. So we switched this from like just full years to specific calendar dates that you could use. Um, the second thing we put in here, or I put in here, was to put in a checkbox to remove this missing values from the calculations. So you can see that here. See, in this particular analysis, we have this NA line here, and when we do this, it goes away. We'll look at the code afterwards, but I just want to show everyone kind of what the output is first. And the last thing, I added this additional dropdown that lets you choose a variable to group the analysis by. So for now, we're just kind of showing the distribution of the prosecution offense, or one of these three kind of outcome variables. But for example, if we wanted to see the prosecution degree by sex or by race, you could see that we have put that in here. So we could see, for example, patterns or other things. So if you add that to the percent, you can kind of see the idea of, or what's the relative percent of, first degree prosecutions by sex, those kinds of ideas. So let's take a look at the code to do this as a little bit of a review. So I'm just going to open the server and the UI here, both in R. Okay, so the first thing we did here was put in this. So I'm looking at the UI. So the way, remember the way we're thinking about the steps to making an app usually starts with the UI and then goes to the server and then kind of back to the UI for the output. That's how I think about it in my head. So you can see here, I put in this date range input as the widget to do the calendar. I've called the ID date range, and I've given it this label here. I actually did a bad job because I should have put, to be more clear, I should have named these. But then you could see I have a start value, I have an end value, so those are the initial values, and then I put a min and a max and a particular format. And then to actually use that, we would travel to the server. So we can see, let's see where we did. Okay, so I updated the logic here in the server for our render table, which kind of did our computations and output our table. So I said this has a couple of the things layered on top, but basically we take in our REST data that we've loaded, and all we had to do was I've done a filter. I've said the arrest date is greater than or equal than the first input that comes from the state range object, and the arrest date. Ooh, this is probably an error. Apologies here. This should be a 2. um, date range 2, and that should filter my data to uh, being um, within the two dates. The next thing we talked about in there was adding this checkbox to remove the missing. So all I had to do with that for the UI was add a widget that did the remove missing a checkbox input. I've called this remove missing and just labeled it remove missing values from calculations. And how I made that work in the server. So if we find where I used remove missing, all I did is add this if logic. So we've done kind of our table computations here. And then as I'm outputting that, basically I'm just removing any rows in the table that have a missing value. So I'm saying keep any rows that basically aren't missing. And the only tricky part here is that the name of the variable in the row is kind of dynamic based off of what we choose. So that's why we have to use this dot data, the input selected column. So this is referencing um, the row, the column in the data set and looking if it has missing data in it. The last piece with the grouping, um, you can see I put the select input here, where the input ID was selected grouping. I gave it a label and these choices, no grouping, sex, or race. And I said the default value was no grouping. And then if we find where we use this in the server, you can see I actually made some logic pass. So I said in our render table, I said if this selected grouping is not equal to no grouping, so that means if we are grouping our data, I'll do one thing, and otherwise, um, I'll not grouping. And you can see the only real difference in this two logic is here we're doing this group by operation by both the outcome column and the group column. And here, when we're not doing the grouping, we're just doing it by the selected outcome. And that's really because, one of our options was none, and none isn't really a variable in our data set. So it's a kind of a workaround, or no grouping, I should say, rather. It's a way to make that work, so that, the code doesn't get mad at us because there's not a variable called no grouping. And it looks like I had to do some slight specific stuff for how to do the percentage when there was grouping versus no grouping, but that's um, kind of it there. Um, any questions about how I did that or struggles with trying to do it yourselves? Okay. Let's jump back. So that was our take-home activity 1. I gave you a fresh data set if you wanted to try to set up the app from scratch. So I called this take home activity 2. And here was the instructions for downloading that. Um, you would have had to put that data into this folder here and then reference it. And I can show you what I did for that. And I basically just left this open-ended, but I said to test out some new ideas that we had learned 2 weeks ago. So here's what I did with that one. Okay, so this was data about recidivism. And so I just pulled out a couple of the outcome variables here. There was a variable for recidivism within 3 years, arrest in year 1, year 2, or year 3. And then there were some variables that I thought might be related to the risk of recidivism. So my kind of motivation for what I was building here was kind of looking at these variables as an outcome, and these variables as kind of associated risk variables, and trying to see um, how these things related. For example, so for example, we could look at the distributions between whether there was or the outcome percent by these different groupings. So the percent with recidivism with 3 years by race, not much of a difference there. But if you look at things like education, there's definitely a gradient um, with that goes with education. You can also look at it with the number of years for prison and prison offense. So I thought that was kind of interesting to look at. And similarly, I think this year one, year two, year three is just kind of a broken down from the recidivism within 3 years. So yeah, that's what I did with this one. I'll just open up the server and the UI quickly to take a peek at it. And this one's pretty simple. Don't have as much as our other example yet. That is the wrong UI. Okay. So the major piece here is in the UI here. Again, just kind of using the template we used before. I have some inputs for the different the selected inputs that I wanted to use, and then here's my table output. And in the server, I'm taking the data which I've loaded, I'm grouping it by the selected input, and then I'm doing some slight calculations on the percentage and the count here. So feel free to take a look at those more if you have not had a chance. Any questions on those ones or this second example? Okay, great. We'll continue to use those kind of working examples throughout here as well as some, potentially take-home ideas if you want to try some of the things we're going to talk about today. Okay, so let's jump back into the material for today. The next step, or the new material for today, the next step in our process for making an app was kind of the last one, which was to add layout and design features to the UI. So up to this point, we've kind of just tossed our UI widgets and tables kind of wherever they landed in our app, but obviously that is not the ideal thing to do. So we want to learn how we can better organize how everything is laid out in our app, maybe add some design features, kind of make the visual presentation better. So we're going to talk about how to do that. So what are the options, how to better organize ourselves in the UI. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about a fluid versus fixed grid layout system. This isn't actually that important to know. If you have up to this point, I've been telling you just to kind of copy the fluid page piece that is at the top of our UI that we've been using and kind of work around it. So the fluid part of the fluid page actually refers to how the sizing of elements in our UI are rendered in the browser. It has to do with kind of the width of things and expanding or contracting to the size of the browser. Essentially, it allows the UI elements to fill up the entire width. There is also something called a fixed page, which only resizes elements up to a maximum width. I almost, I've only ever in production used this kind of fluid page style dashboard, and I would just recommend generally using that unless you have a good reason not to. You don't even really need to know about this fixed page piece, but that is kind of where that fluid in the fluid page at the top of the UI um, is coming from. Okay, so the next thing you need to know about is UI layout math. For whatever reason, the UI here works assuming kind of 12 equals the full width of the screen. So when we're talking about columns in the space of our dashboard, we're going to use kind of 6 to equate half of a page, 12 is the whole page, and so 3 would be a quarter of the page. I'm not sure where that 12 came from. It just is the kind of the way the math works here. So our basic building blocks for our UI, we're going to have rows and columns. We're going to use the command fluid row for our rows. Similarly here, as we talked about this fluid versus fixed thing, there is this fixed row option, but we'll stick to this fluid row. And then we that will give our rows and columns. We'll use this function called column, and then which will give the width of the column to define different columns. So let's add some rows and columns to our example. So here, this is our kind of our working example. Going back, you can see here we're starting off with that fluid page at the top of our UI. But now what I'm going to do is layer in some different rows and columns. Um, Kind of a side note, this is where it starts to pay to try to make sure your code is organized because we're going to have a lot of parentheses, a lot of commas, and it's very easy to lose track of what parentheses closes a row or what parentheses closes a column. You can see I try to do that by tabbing with different indents. And I usually often put a actual comment at the end of a row or column just to help me keep track of what I'm doing. So you can see here we got a fluid row. I'm going to start here within that fluid row. So you can kind of imagine a single row in our URL browser here, and then I'm going to fill in parts of that column. So my first object, I'm gonna kind of make a column of size 4. So with our total screen being 12, this would be a third of the screen. So for our first widget here that we're putting in with this date range widget, I'm gonna make that a third of the screen. I'm then closing that column and I'm starting a new column where I'm putting another one of our widgets for selecting the outcome. And that's also a width of 4, closing that column, and one more column of size 4, which was our grouping. I'm closing that column and then I'm closing that row. The other thing that takes a little bit getting to used to is when you need a comma and when you don't. You only need that comma when you have another object after it. But for example, here where I'm closing a column and then immediately closing a row, I would not want to put a comma after that, or R will get mad at us. So I put those 3 objects in a single row, those UI widgets, and then I'm making another row where instead of having columns be size width 4, I'm making them width 6 here. And then I'm putting 2 checkbox inputs. And then I'm closing that row and making 2 final rows. One is going to be our text output that talks about our selections, and the other is our actual table. And I did something somewhat extra special for these ones. I put an extra parameter here. There is, in addition to the width of the column, you can also specify an offset, meaning how far from the left side of the screen it's going to start. So what this would mean is I want the full column to take up the 12 or the full screen, but start it one in. And the same thing for this one, but you can see we're going to offset it by 4. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this example looks like when we actually run it. I'm going to close some of these. So this is example 1. And I need to reset my working directory here. And then I'll run this code. Okay. So now kind of try to remember what we were doing with our actual UI and seeing how it matches. We had the first row here. We put 3 elements in it. We said each of them would take up a third of the screen. And then that second row, we had 2 elements and they were taking up half the screen. Kind of by default, you'll see that they are left justified here. But the other thing to remember is that dynamic screen sizing. So you can see as they shrink, they're still sticking to that left-hand side here. And then the last 2 bits were this text that we output, which was indented 1, I think, and then our table, which we said was indented 4. So this isn't particularly great looking, but more so to illustrate, how those rows and columns would work and how we can manipulate them. Okay. So those are kind of the basic building blocks that you can use. But there are some other tools that I like to use that give you a little bit more predefined um, kind of measurements and visualizations. So the first one that I use quite a bit is called the sidebar layout. So this is a predefined layout which consists of a sidebar and a main for displaying the output. So I usually use this. If you look at a lot of the dashboards I've created, a lot of them have, usually on the left-hand side, a bunch of user inputs that they can change and choose, and then on kind of the right-hand side, they have a table or a visualization or a map. And this is all coming from this sidebar plus main panel. So the 2 functions we use here, sidebar panel, main panel, and the way we do that is again fluid page we start with. Um, Now the first thing I'm doing is setting up a sidebar panel, and then I'm putting all of the UI widgets that I want to include on that side. And I'm just separating them by a comma here. So I'm putting the date range, the outcome selection, and so forth, all in that sidebar panel. And so this actually closes here. This would have been another good place for me to write a comment and see where it actually closes. And then the second part is the main panel, and that's where I'm going to put my table output. And so another thing to note here is if we really wanted to, we could put rows and columns within this sidebar panel or the main panel. Here, these kinds of laid out nicely without trying to um, put them in. But for example, if you wanted to put 2 inputs kind of left next to each other, left, right, instead of them all falling vertically, as we'll see here, you could do that by adding columns within um, the sidebar panel. So let's take a look at this in practice. Okay. Okay, so now this is what this looks like. You can see the kind of the default formatting here um, gives us this nice gray background as our template for the sidebar. And I have all of the UI inputs here. And then the main panel is here on this right-hand side with our output. So by default, going back to the math of 12 here, um, by default, this main the sidebar panel is has width 4 and the main panel has width 8, but we could actually change that if we wanted. You could we'll see if how well I can do this on the spot. So we could make this, I don't know, we'll make them both 6. And if we were to rerun this, we can now see, these take up approximately half the screen, half my window, in both cases. So that's probably not the right dimensions that we want to do. 6 and 6, 4 and 8 is probably closer to the typical one, which is why it is the default. But you can adjust that as needed. Okay. So that's kind of our some of the basics for our UI. Other things I like to use are specific tools for when we have multiple kind of views. So if we have a lot of content in our app, there are ways to design it to incorporate that. So we could have, for example, multiple tabs in a single page. So just like, a browser, I could have multiple tabs um, that would show up actually in the body of the page. And we could do that with what's called a tab set panel or a nav list panel. Um, and those are just two different options for how to incorporate that. But the thing I like to use most of the time is what's called a nav bar page. And so this gives multiple actual pages within your dashboard or app which you can switch back and forth to. So most of the time, I will end up using this nav bar page. And so how this works is we're actually going to replace the fluid page, which we had been using for everything, with this nav bar page. And then we're going to add some slight additional information. And then our different pages within that are going to be separated by these tab panel commands. So our UI is going to change to look kind of like this. We'll start with this nav bar page at the top. We can give it a title, Florida arrests. I'm separating that then by a comma where I do this tab panel, which will define a separate page. Um, the first thing that goes there is actually the name of that page. I'll call that, I'm going to just make a very simple extra page here where idea of a landing page where, you go to your app and it gives some information about it. So I'm going to have a landing page that's just called welcome, and it will say, welcome to the Florida Arrest Analysis Dashboard. Here is some additional information about the data. We'll end that page there and make our second page, which is kind of all the information which we've been have before. So we'll call that data analysis. And within that, I'm going to set it up just like we had in our sidebar panel, main panel UI setup, which was a little bit nicer. So I just copied the information into that. So let's take a look at what that looks like. This is example 3. And all of the server code is exactly the same. We are just here adjusting the UI code, which is um, a nice part of how this all works. You can really separate the visual aspect from the actual underlying code pretty well, or the underlying manipulations. All right. So here, um, you can see we have the overall name of the dashboard and then the two different tabs we've had. So we have our welcome with our just our little text message here, and then we can click over here on data analysis. It is putting some kind of default coloring here. We'll talk in a little bit how this can be adjusted if we want. But you can see here now we have our welcome, we have our data analysis, and we have our kind of UI setup within that data analysis. So this is starting to get closer to maybe a production uh, ready dashboard where we start to have the layout that we might want in our different sections. And we could add additional pages all along here by just adding those additional tab panels and separating them out. So that is the navbar page. It's kind of my go-to layout for these kinds of dashboards and can be really useful. Okay, so we've talked about kind of the basic UI layout for R Shiny. This is kind of the default, what comes with it. It is not the only way you can design the UI or the only set of tools you can use to do that. There is something called Shiny Dashboard, which is a separate package, which is more like kind of packaged UI for Shiny. It consists kind of the sidebar and these different boxes within it. And we'll look at an example here shortly. And so that uses slightly different syntax to set that up on the UI side. Um, so it has a header, a sidebar, and a body with some options to change the colors and the themes. So this is more along the lines of kind of more is pre-built for you, but you have less options to customize kind of a idea. Um, there is also kind of even more extensive changes. There's different languages for the UI or frameworks. So there is something called Shiny Fluent, which is another package. Um, it's actually I'm not an expert in this, but it's a different Bootstrap framework, or the thing we've been using is called the Bootstrap framework. Um, but this is different. It's called a Fluent framework. It does look very sharp. I'll run this quickly um, for you all to see. But it uses entirely kind of different UI language than we've been using before. So this is the actual dashboard. So just the style of everything looks a little different, but it does look very sharp. I believe it's kind of in the Microsoft world of styling, you can see here. Okay, so there are other options, not just what I've showed you, and some of them are more advanced. I've never built an actual dashboard with this Shiny Fluent before because it is kind of more a low-level language of the tools right now, but it does look very nice. Let's take a look at this Shiny dashboard example, just because I think this is a good kind of intermediate option if you are interested in it. And so I've adjusted our working example to be used to be coming from the Shiny dashboard. Um, the basic difference now is the UI is going to be divided up into multiple parts. We said that this has three parts, a header, a sidebar, and a body. And so now what we do in our UI is actually we say header equals some sort of dashboard header. I just give it a title, Florida arrests. Sidebar, I'm putting kind of all those widgets in this. And so I say sidebar equals dashboard sidebar and put all that information in there. And then the body, I'm going to put our table output in here. And there's just a function dashboard body. And then to kind of pull it all together at the bottom, I put, say, dashboard page with these three elements. And then still, I'm not adjusting the server at all. Okay, so let's take a look at what this looks like. Let's go to example for Shiny dashboard and remember to set my working directory. And here we go. So this is a nicely formatted and laid out kind of prepackaged UI that we didn't have to do much work for. It does have some nice default. This is kind of triggering the sidebar can go away. But here's our same UI widgets for our inputs. And then our additional variable selections and everything in our content kind of gets output here on the right-hand side. So that is the Flex dashboard or Shiny dashboard. Excuse me. Flex dashboard is a different thing. Um, so those are kind of layout options difference. One additional thing we can easily do is adjust the theme of our dashboard. So that controls the look and the feel of the components. Um, Basically everything except the graphics you make yourself in the server, which we'll talk about plots a little bit more today. So there are several pre-built themes that can be accessed using R packages. You can also get into the kind of the low-level detail here. Um, you can create your own CSS file, cascading style sheet, I believe that stands for, and point to it in that www folder we talked about can contain additional files that are accessible from the web. You can sometimes take an existing CSS file, update it, the key things you need if you to make your own style here. In either case, we just need to add a theme argument to our top level UI function. So if we actually go back to one of our earlier examples, we can just try this out. Um, all it takes is if we kind of go back to our navbar page example, under title, we'll just add another argument that says theme, and I'm going to use the Shiny Themes package. And I'm just choosing one here called Superhero, but there are also ones called Cosmo, Cyborg, Darkly, etc. So I'm gonna open up our navbar page example. Make sure I stop this. And I actually need to open up the UI here. And oh, I had already put this in and accidentally uh, saved it. So this was using the Cosmos Shiny theme. So, but I could use um, Superhero. Oops. I rerun this. We get a totally different feel and look to our dashboard here. We could also try I think one of them was called Darkly. You're into uh, black background and white text. So there's a bunch of different options um, in terms of what's available for free, and then you can also kind of build your own if you are want to go down that road. So that is themes, and that'll work for this is not works it works for things other than just the navbar page, any of the kind of the typical UI um, elements that we've been using. If you stick that theme at the top, you'll get a different theme there. One last thing on our UI stylings is the HTML and adding different elements to it. So far in our dashboard examples, we've just been kind of writing regular text that will show up in the dashboard. But for example, if you want to do things like add different sizes, bolding, italicize, underlining, all those things can be accomplished with a little bit of HTML added into our dashboard. So there's this idea of what's called an HTML tag, which are instructions for how to display or format text. Um, there are a few cases where you'll need kind of two tags back to back, things like line breaks that are except for a few cases like line breaks, we usually use pairs of things, of symbols to indicate where the beginning and the ending is. So, for example, if we want to bold a string of text, we have a beginning bold and an ending bold symbol where B here is for bold. There's things like that for italicize and underline and similar things like that. So if we were to actually render this HTML here, I'm actually doing that. So that translates into I am this bolded text here down below. So there's lots of different tags you can use. Bolding text with a B, italicized text with an I. Each case uses this backslash to end the chunk um, of text with whatever the style is, different header levels, a horizontal rule, lists, paragraphs, hyperlinks, all that kind of stuff can be set up with the right HTML tag. We can also write HTML directly into our app. So this can be used if we're kind of combining um, maybe some inputs with some user inputs with some HTML. So say for whatever reason, you let people input some sort of text and you wanted to apply some kind of um, bolding or heading to it style before you output it. You can do that with this HTML function here, where pasting together different pieces of text. So here, for example, I've said hello world, put a line break, and then this is actually the code for putting a hyperlink to, let's see, I put a hyperlink to our Shiny here. So the same thing will work in our dashboards. Okay, so those are the tags. You can also use these tags directly, kind of coming from the Shiny package, rather than writing these kind of text strings with this HTML. And so there's a lots of things within them. There's, over 100 different HTML tags. I don't know what all these things do, but you could look them up if you were looking for something specific. So just that's more so, additional kind of layout elements, visual style for your dashboard. We won't go into any of those right now in our example, but just know that those are there if you need them. Okay. So this takes us up to kind of that last step, which we were hoping to accomplish in our basic outline. Now we know how to, load the data, use the widgets, combine things in the server, place the outputs in the UI, and then lastly, add that layout and design features to the UI. Okay, so that is the end of our section on the UI. I thought, and I'll just pause there for a moment to see if there's any questions or comments or any thoughts from folks. Okay, we'll keep on moving on here. Our next topic for today, we're going to talk about static plots coming from the ggplot2 package, kind of the default um, plotting software that most people use in R these days. So we'll use that and how to incorporate them in our dashboards. I'm going to do just a quick kind of overview of ggplot because it has this kind of special syntax that if you haven't used it before is a little bit uncommon at first. But ggplot2, it's a very commonly used graphic package in R. It is based on, there's a book called The Grammar of Graphics, and it kind of follows the layout of that. Um, you add options and layers to your plots or graphics kind of one at a time, where the layers and the steps are separated by a plus symbol in your code. So it's kind of you start with a layer, you add another layer, so and add some options. Um, all with this plus symbol. This does get a little bit confusing. Sometimes I forget there, we've been using this pipe symbol between different steps of some of our analysis. Now we also have this plus symbol between the ggplots. I will admit that I sometimes forget between the two when I'm working with ggplot, and I will catch myself putting pipes between them, which will not work. So, I'm just going to start off with an example outside of our dashboard just to get us a little bit familiar with ggplot2. Um, so this is just code. I'm actually going to copy this to the RStudio console. But what I'm doing here, first I'm just loading some of our packages, which we're using, our new one, ggplot2. If you don't have that, you'll need to do an install.packages to make sure you have that loaded in. Just loading in our data. And then I am summarizing the prosecution level, getting the counts by the prosecution level to make this data one object. And then I'm going to work with it to make a graphic. And so the way this works, you kind of always start off with this ggplot function, and you feed it the name, your data object. So we start with a new ggplot and supply it a data set. And then I add a plus. The next kind of layer I'm putting in is the aesthetic mapping. So this is this AES function. So that's where you tell it kind of what are the X's, the Y's, the colors, the groups, how it kind of maps the variables onto the concepts for the visualization. So here I'm going to say our X is that prosecution level variable. The Y is this count variable, which we just made coming from our data. And then the last thing I'm layering in here is our visualization. So this is a scatter plot. So the kind of the command for the scatter plot within ggplot is this geom point. So I'm actually going to copy this and go to RStudio. And I'm just going to put this in a new script. And then I will run it. Hopefully it works. Okay. So what I get out of this is a nice plot here. And so all it's doing is our data set here, if we were to look at it, it was just the prosecution level and then the count in each case. So we're just doing a scatter plot of these two variables here, just the number by, well, not really a scatter plot because of the x isn't numeric, but just a dot plot of the prosecution type and the count here. So that's kind of the default ggplot we have there. So other things we may want to do here, we may want to add some sort of groupings and color. So if we go back to our analysis and we group the data additionally by sex, um, and then the way we layer that in, um, kind of with our grouping and our color, is to add an additional option in the aesthetic mapping here, where I say fill equals sex. So what that's saying is kind of the what variable will be the color here it's gonna turn into. Um, and then rather than doing this dot plot, I'm going to use a bar plot. And the command for that is this geom bar. Um, and then two other things I'm actually using here. This position equals dodge. What that is going to tell the plot to do is rather than stacking the groups on top of each other to put them next to each other. And the stat equals identity just is actually telling it to use the raw counts here in our bar plot rather than trying to do an aggregation itself. So I will copy this code, go back to our terminal. So if we run this, now we see we have our grouped plot by sex and our different prosecution levels. And we get these nice colors by the groups as well as the levels. All right, further customization, other things you typically want to do in plots. Um, you may want to add a title. So if to add a title across the whole thing, we use this GG title option. There's other ways to do this, but this is kind of the simplest. So I'll say prosecution level by sex counts. Um, I'll add labels for the x-axis, labels for the y-axis, and then also if, for example, if I wanted to change the angle of the tick mark on the x-axis, because you could see I was having to, make this bigger so these don't collide each other. So instead, if I wanted them at an angle so they fit better in the graphic, I could do that with this theme axis.text.y equals element text. And we can put that in here. Oh, I did it on the y-axis, not the x-axis. But I could do it. Oh yeah, y. We could additionally do that on the uh, x-axis instead if we wanted as well. So those are all options. There is a lot to know. I don't know. I don't personally know most of these commands off the top of my head. There is this entire kind of there's a cheat sheet which you can use, which has, what are the different visualizations? What are some of the different options? Do you want to add faceting? All this stuff, it's best to not try to memorize it, but reference some of these cheat sheets. And then, there's whole books devoted to ggplot too. So hopefully this just gives you a little bit of a taste for it or a review if you haven't used it in a little bit of a while because we want to use this in our dashboard now. So our next step is we've exclusively been working with tables so far. We want to change that to add some plots into our dashboard. So important changes that we're going to make to be able to do that here. Um, so here in our UI, I've just adjusted the label for our checkbox input to add the percent column to talk about showing the percent rather than calculating it because it will be in our plot. But the main piece here, I've adjusted our output for the UI to be an output plot. And the big thing here is this was a plot table output before, and now we need to use the correct function here, plot output. This output plot is something I'm going to make in the server. Rather than doing a render table, I'm now doing a render plot. I'm doing a lot of the same computations there first, but now I'm going to use my ggplot uh, commands that we know how to do. So if I, let's see, if I am using a grouping after I've kind of computed the table here, which I will first call a ggplot on my data. Out is what I was calling kind of the table that's been computed underneath. My X is going to be the selected outcome. My Y is going to be the Y variable here. So just like we did with when we were talking about the dplyr verbs, where we have to use this kind of like indirect way to reference things, we have to use that same style here in ggplot. So you'll see this dot data, double brackets, the name of my input, right? That, as a reminder, this dot data is referring to the data set that is being used in the ggplot at the time. So this is kind of a generic way of calling the name of a column that we want to use for our data set, because ggplot also uses that data masking idea where if I were to just tell it input selected outcome, it would be looking for a literal variable called input selected outcome. So we kind of have to use a slightly roundabout way to tell it the variable when it is dynamic like this in our dashboard. So we're choosing a variable that is being held by that input selected outcome. The Y is going to be coming from this Y variable, which is, I'm just using this if-else logic here. If that percent column is used, we'll plot the percent. Otherwise, we'll present the count. And then the fill is the grouping. And the only difference between these two pieces of logic is just if we have a grouping, we're going to use this fill. If not, we're just ignoring that piece. And then I'm going to make a bar plot, and I'm going to adjust here the X labels so they better fit with the tick mark. And I'll do this at a 90-degree angle. All right, so those were the important changes. Let's take a look at what that looks like now. This is example 5. So we're still using our navbar page, but now we have a plot instead of a table. So we still have the same input here on the left-hand side. We can change these options, and we get different visualizations here. So this is the count. Rather than the count, if we want to see the percent, which is especially helpful for when we do this grouping, because, for example, the counts within the sex groups, male and female, are pretty different. So it's probably better to look at percent for relative differences. So this, for example, is comparing the degree of prosecution between the different groups. We also have, I left my remove missing value calculation in there as well. You can see this just goes away. And we get our ggplot. The main one of the struggles with doing these kinds of visualizations is making it look good no matter what combination of inputs you selected. So, for example, the major reason why I shifted the labels here to be vertical rather than typically they would be horizontal by default is because we don't know how many, we have examples where we have this many. Um, Different categories, or we have, may have many fewer. So, this example, the prosecution degree, for example, we probably could have left this one um, horizontal rather than vertical, but, we need to kind of build for any of the input options here. So that is our first ggplot example. And find my slides again. Any questions on ggplot? The major thing is just kind of learning to use that indirect syntax, and then rather than output table, we're using the output plot uh, instead. Okay, the last thing I wanted to touch on for today, and I see that we're getting toward the end of our time, so we may have to skip a little bit and come back to this, but our reactive expressions. Okay, so far in our servers for our dashboard, we've been kind of doing things, our computations all at once. So when we needed to make the output for a table or a plot, we've been doing all the computations within the creation of that table or plot. But sometimes as we get kind of more complicated into our dashboards, into the things we're trying to do, it will be helpful to make intermediate objects in the server. So, for example, say say I wanted to have both a table and a plot in my dashboard. I want the same information to be there in both cases. I only want to compute it once, but I want to output it in the two different places in the two different formats. Um, we can do that with a reactive expression. Um, Also, it's also helpful to control the workflow options when we have a big complicated process. So I may make a little piece of something over here. I may make a different piece over here, and then I may combine that in our ultimate output. And this helps us kind of also compartmentalize code sometimes to make things simpler to work with. So we're going to do this in the server with this function called reactive. And so we're going to call it, it's going to use both a parentheses and a curly bracket. Um, the reason that is it works a lot like a function. So we think of reactive like defining a function where it's actually going to hold information. It's going to take the inputs. It's going to do some computations and going to have an output. But then we can use it later on as well. So functions typically have parentheses and curly brackets. That's my only best guess of why we need them here as well. So let's look at an example. So we're going to turn our data calculations into a reactive expression here. We're going to have to do the similar steps we've been using to create our tables and plots before. We're just going to use the same reactive object then to create both. So if we look at my code here, I'm going to make a new object in the server called tab data, which is a reactive. And this just has the logic that takes our data, our arrest data here, does our filtering, our grouping, our summarizing, our aggregating with all of our different objects or options, removes the missing, all that kind of stuff, and then just returns it. So rather, we're just going to kind of stop the process before we make the table or make the plot. And this will just be kind of the manipulations of the data rather than kind of the output. You'll see me use this out a lot of times. That is kind of just my personal shorthand for the output that I'm going to have for the function. So if you see that, it doesn't mean anything special. It's kind of just my own way of symbolizing what is the thing I'm actually going to output. Just a little reminder. So again, that's going to be a reactive. Then we can also, for example, make a reactive that would be the name that we want to give our ggplot. So this is going to be dynamic based off of the variables which we choose to use. So I'm just going to have some logic that says, depending on my grouping, I'm going to have some text, either blank or I'm going to insert by the group. I'm going to have some logic that says, if they've selected a count or a percent, I'll use the word percentages or counts. And then I'm just going to put all that together. So it's going to basically say like the variable name, percentage, and then either by, sex or race, or then just by, or just blank there. And again, this is going to be a reactive that's going to go in our server. That's just kind of a placeholder, which we can use later on. To actually use these farther down in our workflow, we can access them by putting a parentheses behind their name. So for example, we've called these plot title and tab data to use them later on when, for example, we output our table or a plot. I'll just say tab data with these two parentheses to say kind of give me the value of that reactive, or thinking of it like a function. Give me the value of that function right at this point. And same thing for the plot title. So you just need to remember when you're using them later on to add these parentheses behind them. Okay, so here's our updated example. I added back the table alongside our plot to the UI, so we could have both at once for our reactive. So in our server, so you can see here, let's see, we made our tab data reactive. We have our plot title reactive. Now for our render plot, which is actually what the thing that's going to create our ggplot. What we've replaced is we're now using this tab data with the two parentheses directly in the data. So we're using similar code here. We're just rather than having to do the computations as part within this render plot, I can just directly use this tab data. Similarly with the plot title, I'm going to use that as the title of my ggplot, and I just use that with the two parentheses. And then with my output table, I can use that same tab data reactive and return that as my table to go alongside my plot. So this is example 5. Let's take a look at that. Oh, that is not example 5, example 6. Apologies for the typo. Okay, so now we have both our ggplot and our table, and when we change them, right, what's actually happening, I changed the input. The input is going to do the calculation in the reactive, and then that reactive is sending the information to both the plot and the table, which are output in the UI. So, it serves a couple purposes. We don't want to make redundant code or computations, so it's best to reuse things when we can, and it kind of simplifies things into different pieces. So that is reactives. There are some extensions. These are kind of more complex ideas within Shiny, but just kind of for your knowledge that they exist. There are things called reactive value or reactive values that alongside reactive work slightly differently. My advice would be stick with using this reactive concept we talked about today until you've mastered it, and you actually need a solution where you need one of these reactive value or reactive values. They are a little bit more complicated to work with and really only good for have an advantage over a reactive in a couple specific situations where you kind of have a underlying state value of something you need to keep track of. So that would be my advice on those. One kind of other extension to these reactives that I want to talk about, which comes up a lot with some of the work that I do in dashboards, is this idea of isolation. So the way Shiny works is everything, all the computations that we've done so far are kind of what you might call greedy or eager. So as we change an input, any affected output, the table, the plot will automatically change. But sometimes we don't want that behavior. Um, there are sometimes circumstances when, a user has a lot of inputs they need to go through, and you don't necessarily want the output, the plot or the table to change every time they pick one of those separately. You kind of want to wait till they select all their inputs, and then make the computation. This could also be a case where, maybe it takes a second or two or 10 to do some sort of more complicated computation. So you really want them to choose all their inputs first, so then you can have that one expensive compute at the end. Or just even for clarity, you don't want the output to be there until they're ready to see it. So in this case, I basically will use a run button in combination with this isolate, meaning that a user picks a bunch of inputs and nothing would change in terms of the outputs until they actually click that kind of run button or compute, however you want to think about it. So what we're going to do is adjust the server so that the output is only executed when the user clicks the run button and not otherwise. And we'll use this isolate to do it. Um, the first thing we'll need to do is add an action button to the UI. Um, this is really simple syntax that we'll use here. It's just action button. Again, like all our UI elements, you can think of this similarly as a widget. It has an input ID, which we'll need to use in the server to reference it. So when someone clicks it, we'll need to know what the kind of the object is to identify it, to tell the server to execute. And then we'll just give it a label. So that's our action button. And then how this isolate works in the server is that we kind of, in our render plot, we wrap the pieces of our server, which we want to not trigger changes in this isolate. So what this would mean is so this update plot is going to be the name of the action button. So what this is saying is this update plot is outside of this isolate piece. So it says things outside the isolate can trigger the output, but things inside the isolate do not trigger the output. So it means if any of these kind of inputs change, these were all our kind of user UI selections. They will not change our output only because I've left this update plot outside of the isolate. That is the only thing here which can, in fact, render our plot. So let's take a quick look at this. I've specifically only done this for the plot, so we could kind of see how we can make it different for, for whatever reason, it is unhappy with me. For whatever reason, if we wanted to, have it work for the table but not the plot, or the plot and not the table, just to show you what that would look like. All right, so now we have this update the plot button that we're using. So say, I'm choosing prosecution grouping because we didn't do this as part of the table. When I change it, this changes as the user selection goes in the output, but my actual ggplot output did not change, but it does change when I hit update the plot. So it's probably not best to do it like this. This would be very confusing with the different reactivity of the two pieces. We would most likely want them to be tied together, but just to illustrate how you would make that run button work with the isolate. Okay. Any questions on isolate or how that is working? Okay. Have about 5 minutes left, just to kind of review where we're at. We talked about kind of our last step of making an app. We added layout and design features. Um, we talked about adding static plots with ggplot to our app. And then lastly, we got into reactive and expressions, including the use of that isolate function. Um, I will note that you can use that isolate function with other things than the run button. It is not necessarily tied to that, but that's just a way that I have typically used it in my work. Okay, so I've set up another take-home activity for folks if they want to try some more things with our two examples. So with our current working example, here's some ideas if you wanted to try out some of the concepts we've talked about today. Um, You could adjust the UI layout to better place the table in the app, adjust the colors or background in our plot, maybe change the visualization if there's something that made sense. You could consider maybe a comparison over time. We have a time filter. Um, maybe something that like, what is the counts over different months or different years? And then also see if you could figure out to adjust the action button so both the table and plot are only updated when that action button is clicked. If you wanted to try things off kind of on that fresher, newer data set, some things you could practice with the concepts we talked about today, adding a layout and theme, adding a ggplot as part of the output, and then using some sort of reactive expressions in the dashboard. So those are all things you could try between now and next week. I hope um, you join us next week as well. What we're planning to talk about is adding even more interactivity. So we've kind of been using vanilla tables and plots so far, but there is kind of better things to use or things that I prefer to use in our dashboard, which gives us some level of interactivity, hover tooltips with data tables, and interactive plots with Plotly, and then also interactive maps with Leaflet. So we'll be tackling those topics next week. Any questions from folks? I saw one hand very quickly. Allison, maybe? Maybe I'm not seeing them
Sorry,
very.
no, that was an accident.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, and if you need to catch up, the slides in are on the that GitHub before, and all of the examples you should be able to run.
Yeah, and also, Robert, the recording from the first session is on our YouTube page, and I will get this one up there as soon as possible too.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. And if you do have questions, if you're trying to work on some of these exercises, I'm happy to um, answer questions during the week. Feel free to reach out. I think Jason can get you my contact info if you want to ask questions about those, if you're trying those out yourself.
Great. I don't see any other questions, so thank you, Dr. Ashmead, for the another great session today. And